In modern cultures, accusations of witchcraft have been used to express or settle social tensions throughout history. However, in pre-modern Western society, where irrational fear and a persecuting mentality coexisted, the accusations had different effects that eventually gave rise to the witch hunts. A witch hunt, or a witch purge, is a search for people who have been labeled witches or a search for evidence of witchcraft. The classical period of witch hunts in early modern Europe and colonial America took place in the early modern period or about 1450 to 1750, spanning the upheavals of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, resulting in an estimated 35,000 to 50,000 executions. In the medieval era, Christian doctrine had denied the belief in the existence of witches and witchcraft, condemning it as a pagan superstition. Some have argued that the work of the Dominican Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century helped lay the groundwork for a shift in Christian doctrine, by which certain Christian theologians eventually began to accept the possibility of collaboration with devils, resulting in a person obtaining certain real supernatural powers. In ancient Near East, punishment for malevolent magic is addressed in the earliest law codes which were preserved, in both ancient Egypt and Babylonia, where it played a conspicuous part. The Code of Hammurabi is a Babylonian legal text composed in 18th century prescribes that if a man has put a spell upon another man and it is not yet justified, he upon whom the spell is laid shall go to the holy river, into the holy river shall he plunge. If the holy river overcomes him and he is drowned, the man who put the spell upon him shall take possession of his house. If the holy river declares him innocent and he remains unharmed, the man who laid the spell shall be put to death. He that plunged into the river shall take possession of the house of him who laid the spell upon him. In 451 BC, the 12 tables of Roman law had provisions against evil incantations and spells intended to damage cereal crops. In 331 BC, 170 women were executed as witches in the context of an epidemic illness. Livy emphasizes that this was a scale of persecution without precedent in Rome. The most detailed account of a trial for witchcraft in classical Greece is the story of Theris of Lemnos, who was executed along with her children in early 338 BC, supposedly for casting incantations and using harmful drugs. In 186 BC, the Roman Senate issued a decree severely restricting the Bacchanalia, ecstatic rites celebrated in honor of Dionysus. Livy records that this persecution was because there was nothing wicked, nothing flagitious, that had not been practiced among them. Consequent to the ban, in 184 BC, about 2,000 members of the Bacchus cult were executed, and in 182 to 180 BC another 3,000 executions took place. Persecution of witches continued in the Roman Empire until the late 4th century AD and abated only after the introduction of Christianity as the Roman state religion in the 390s. Lucius Cornelius Sulla in 81 BC became an important source of late medieval and early modern European law on witchcraft. The Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Beneficiis was implemented and banned the trading and possession of harmful drugs and poisons, possession of magical books and other occult paraphernalia. Strabo, Gaius Maecenas and Cassius Dio all reiterate the traditional Roman opposition against sorcery and divination, and Tacitus used the term religio superstitio to class these outlawed observances. Emperor Augustus strengthened legislation aimed at curbing these practices, in 31 BC, by burning over 2,000 magical books in Rome, except for certain portions of the hallowed Sibylline books. While Tiberius Claudius was emperor, 45 men and 85 women, who were all suspected of sorcery, were executed. The Hebrew Bible criticized sorcery in Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12 says, "No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one that casts spells, or who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles from the dead. For whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord," and in Exodus 22 verse 18 says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Tales like that of 1 Samuel 28, about the witch of Endor Saul asked to summon prophet Samuel for revelation, and Samuel foretells about his death, the death of his sons, and the defeat of the Israel to the Philistines. suggests that in practice sorcery could at least lead to exile or death. In Judean Second Temple period around 516 BCE, Simeon ben Shetach in the 1st century sentenced to death 80 women who had been charged with witchcraft on a single day in Ashkelon. Later the woman's relatives took revenge by bringing false accusations against Simeon's son and causing him to be executed in turn. The 6th century AD Getica of Jordan's records a persecution and expulsion of witches among the Goths in a mythical account of the origin of the Huns. The ancient fabled King Philomer is said to have found among his people certain witches, whom he called in his native tongue Haliurani. Suspecting these women, he expelled them from the midst of his race and compelled them to wander in solitary exile afar from his army. There's the unclean spirits, who beheld them as they wandered through the wilderness, bestowed their embraces upon them and begot this savage race, which dwelt at first in the swamps, a stunted, foul and puny tribe, scarcely human, and having no language save one which bore but slight resemblance to human speech. Christianization in the early Middle Ages. The Council of Elvira, 306 AD, Synod of Ancyra, 314 AD, and the Quinisex Council, also known as Council of Trullo in 692 AD, imposed certain ecclesiastical penances for devil worship. This mild approach represented the view of the Church for many centuries. The general desire of the Catholic Church's clergy to check fanaticism about witchcraft and necromancy is shown in the decrees of the Council of Paderborn, which, in 785 AD, explicitly outlawed condemning people as witches and condemned to death anyone who burnt a witch. The Lombard Code of 643 AD states, "Let nobody presume to kill a foreign serving maid or female servant as a witch, for it is not possible, nor ought to be believed by Christian minds." This conforms to the teachings of the Canon Episcopi of circa 900 AD, alleged to date from 314 AD, which stated that witchcraft did not exist. Other examples include an Irish synod in 800 AD, and a sermon by a Gobard of Lyons, 810 AD. Also, the King of Hungary King Kalman, in degree of his first legislative book published in 1100, banned witch hunting because he said, "Witches do not exist." Bacchad the Bishop of Worm was bishop of the imperial city of Worm in the Holy Roman Empire, about 1020, and the author of the canon law collection of 20 books known as the Decretorum Libri Viginti. Burchard was writing against the superstitious belief in magical potions. But he altogether rejected the possibility of many of the alleged powers with which witches were popularly credited. Such, for example, were nocturnal riding through the air, the changing of a person's disposition from love to hate, the control of thunder, rain, and sunshine, the transformation of a man into an animal, the intercourse of incubus and succubus with human beings, and other such superstitions. Not only the attempt to practice such things, but the very belief in their possibility, is treated by Burchard as false and superstitious. Pope Gregory VII was the head of the Catholic Church and ruler of Papal State in 1080, wrote to King Harald Hen of Denmark forbidding witches to be put to death upon presumption of their having caused storms or failure of crops or pestilence. There were many such efforts to prevent unjust treatment of innocent people. On many occasions, priests who spoke with authority did their best to disabuse the people of their superstitious belief in witchcraft. A comparable situation in Russia is suggested in a sermon by Serapion of Vladimir, written in 1274-1275, where the popular superstition of witches causing crop failures is false. Early secular laws against witchcraft include those promulgated by the King of Anglo-Saxon, King Athelstan in 924-939, say, "And we have ordained respecting witchcrafts, and liebacks or sorcery, and morthdades or murder, mortal sin if anyone should be thereby killed, and he could not deny it, that he be liable in his life. But if he will deny it, and at trial by ordeal shall be guilty, that he be 120 days in prison, and after that let kindred take him out, and give to the king 120 shillings, and pay the man price to his kindred, and enter into bore for him, that he evermore desist from the like." In some prosecutions for witchcraft, torture permitted by the Roman civil law apparently took place. However, Pope Nicholas I, also called Nicholas the Great, 866 AD, prohibited the use of torture altogether. And a similar decree may be found in the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Condemnations of witchcraft are also found in the writings of Saint Augustine, also known as Augustine of Hippo, and early theologians, who made little differences between witchcraft and the practices of pagan religions. Many believed witchcraft did not exist in a philosophical sense. Witchcraft was based on illusions and powers of evil, which Augustine likened to darkness, a non-entity representing the absence of light. Augustine and his supporter like Saint Thomas Aquinas, nevertheless, promulgated elaborate demonologies, including the belief that humans could enter pacts with demons, which became the basis of future witch hunts. Many clerics of the Middle Ages openly or covertly practiced Goetia, believing that as Christ granted his disciples power to command demons, to summon and control demons was not, therefore, a sin. Witch hunting seems to have persisted as a cultural phenomenon. Throughout the early medieval period, notable rulers prohibited both witchcraft and pagan religions, often on pain of death. Under Charlemagne, for example, Christians who practiced witchcraft were enslaved by the church, while those who worshipped the devil, Germanic gods, were killed outright. Witch hunting also appears in period literature. According to Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic historian, King Olaf Tryggvason, the king of Norway from 995–1000, furthered the Christian conversion of Norway by luring pagan magicians to his hall under false pretenses, barring the doors and burning them alive. Some who escaped were later captured and drowned. Later in Middle Ages, the manuals of the Roman Catholic Inquisition remained highly skeptical of witch accusations. In the 13th century, the newly formed Inquisition was commissioned to deal with the Cathars or Gnostic of Southern France, whose teachings were charged with including witchcraft and magic. Although it has been proposed that the witch hunt developed in Europe from the early 14th century, after the Cathars and the Knights Templar, also known as Order of Solomon's Temple, were suppressed, this hypothesis has been rejected independently by all academic historians. In year 1258, Pope Alexander IV, the head of Catholic Church and ruler papal state, declared that Inquisition would not deal with cases of witchcraft unless they were related to heresy. Although Pope John XXII had later authorized the Inquisition to prosecute sorcerers in 1320, inquisitorial courts rarely dealt with witchcraft save incidentally when investigating heterodoxy. In the case of the Madonna Oriente, the Inquisition of Milan was not sure what to do with two women who, in 1384, confessed to have participated in the society around Signora Oriente or Diana. Through their confessions, both of them conveyed the traditional folk beliefs of white magic. The women were accused again in 1390 and condemned by the inquisitor. They were eventually executed by the secular arm. In a notorious case in 1425, Hermann II, Count of Celje, accused his daughter-in-law Veronica of Decius of witchcraft, and, though she was acquitted by the court, he had her drowned. The accusations of witchcraft are, in this case, considered to have been a pretext for Hermann to get rid of an unsuitable match, Veronica being born into the lower nobility and thus unworthy of his son. Catholic figure who preached against witchcraft was popular Franciscan preacher Bernardino of Siena in 1380–1444. Bernardino's sermons reveal both a phenomenon of superstitious practices and an overreaction against them by the common people. However, Bernardino had in mind not merely the use of spells and enchantments and such like fooleries but much more serious crimes, chiefly murder and infanticide. This is clear from his much-quoted sermon of 1427. In which he says, "One of them told and confessed, without any pressure, that she had killed 30 children by bleeding them. And she confessed more, saying she had killed her own son. Answer me, does it really seem to you that someone who has killed 20 or 30 little children in such a way has done so well that when finally they are accused before the Signoria you should go to their aid and beg mercy for them?" Perhaps the most notorious witch trial in history was the trial of Joan of Arc. Although the trial was politically motivated, and the verdict later overturned, the position of Joan as a woman and an accused witch became significant factors in her execution. Joan's punishment of being burned alive, victims were usually strangled before burning, was reserved solely for witches and heretics, the implication being that a burned body could not be resurrected on Judgment Day. Transition to the early modern witch hunts. The comeback of witch hunt at the end of the medieval period, taking place with at least partial support or at least tolerance on the part of the Church, was accompanied with a number of developments in Christian doctrine. For example, the recognition of the existence of witchcraft as a form of satanic influence and its classification as a heresy. As Renaissance occultism gained traction among the educated classes, the belief in witchcraft, which in the medieval period had been part of the folk religion of the uneducated rural population at best, was incorporated into an increasingly comprehensive theology of Satan as the ultimate source of all maleficium. These doctrinal shifts were completed in the mid-15th century, specifically in the wake of the Council of Basel and centered on the Duchy of Savoy in the Western Alps, leading to an early series of witch trials by both secular and ecclesiastical courts in the second half of the 15th century. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued Summis Desiderans Affectibus, a papal bull authorizing the correcting, imprisoning, punishing, and chastising of devil worshippers who have slain infants, among other crimes. He did so at the request of Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, who had been refused permission by the local bishops in Germany to investigate. However, historians such as Ludwig von Pastor insist that the bull neither allowed anything new, nor was necessarily binding on Catholic consciences. 3 years later, in 1487, Kramer published the notorious Malleus Maleficarum or Hammer of Witches, which, because of the newly invented printing presses, enjoyed a wide readership. It was reprinted in 14 editions by 1520 and became unduly influential in the secular courts. In early modern Europe and colonial America, the witch hunt came in waves and subsided. There were trials in the 15th and early 16th centuries, but then the witch scare went into decline, before becoming a major issue again and peaking in the 17th century, particularly during the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. What had previously been a belief that some people possessed supernatural abilities, which were sometimes used to protect the people, now became a sign of a pact between the people with supernatural abilities and the devil. To justify the killings, Protestants, Christians, and its proxy secular institutions deemed witchcraft as being associated to wild satanic ritual cult in which there was naked dancing and ritual murder libel, also known as cannibalistic infanticide by murdering Christian boys and used their blood to perform religious ritual. It was also seen as heresy for going against the first of the 10 Commandments, "You shall have no other gods before me." Further, Scripture was also frequently cited, especially the Exodus decree that, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," Exodus 22 verse 18, which many supported. Witch hunts were seen across early modern Europe, but the most significant area of witch hunting in modern Europe is often considered to be central and southern Germany. Germany was a late starter in terms of the numbers of trials, compared to other regions of Europe. Witch hunts first appeared in large numbers in southern France and Switzerland during the 14th and 15th centuries. A lot of execution happened in the southern Germany around 1561 to 1670. The first major persecution happened in Europe, when witches were caught, tried, convicted, and burned in the imperial lordship of Wiesensteig in southwestern Germany, in record in 1563 in the unbound book called True and Horrifying Deeds of 63 Witches. Witchcraft persecution spread to all areas of Europe. Learned European ideas about witchcraft and demonological ideas strongly influenced the hunt for witches in the north. These witch hunts were at least partly driven by economic factors, since a significant relationship between economic pressure and witch hunting activity can be found for regions such as Bavaria and Scotland. The burning of witches also increased following the Reformation of 1536 in Denmark. Mostly in the times of King Christian IV of Denmark, he encouraged this practice and hundreds of people were convicted of witchcraft and burnt. Also, in Finnmark, a region of Norway, multiple witchcraft trials took place during the period 1600 to 1692. A memorial of international format, Stalniset Memorial, has been built to respect the victims of the Finnmark witchcraft trials. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1542 regulated the penalty for practicing witchcraft. In the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland, over 70 people were accused of witchcraft on account of bad weather when James VI of Scotland, who shared the Danish king's interest in witch trials, sailed to Denmark in 1590 to meet his betrothed Anne of Denmark. According to a widely circulated pamphlet, News from Scotland, James VI personally presided over the torture and execution of Dr. Fine. James published a witch-hunting manual, Demonology, which contains the famous dictum, "Experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture." Later, the Pendle witch trials of 1612 joined the ranks of the most famous witch trials in English history. Witch hunting in England would reach its apex in 1644 to 1647 due to the efforts of Puritan Matthew Hopkins, who was an English witch hunter. Although operating without an official Parliament commission, Hopkins, calling himself Witchfinder General, and his accomplices charged hefty fees to towns during the English Civil War. Hopkins' witch-hunting spree was brief but significant. 300 convictions and deaths are attributed to his work. Hopkins wrote a book on his methods, describing his fortuitous beginnings as a witch hunter, the methods used to extract confessions, and the test he employed to test the accused, stripping them naked to find the witch's mark, the swimming test, and pricking the skin. The swimming test, which included throwing a witch, who was strapped to a chair, into a bucket of water to see if she floated, was discontinued in 1645 due to a legal challenge. The 1647 book, The Discovery of Witches, soon became an influential legal text. The book was used in the American colonies as early as May 1647, when Margaret Jones was executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts. 17 people executed for witchcraft in the colonies from 1647 to 1663. Witch hunts began to occur in North America while Hopkins was hunting witches in England. In 1645, 46 years before the notorious Salem witch trials, Springfield, Massachusetts experienced America's first accusations of witchcraft when husband and wife Hugh and Mary Parsons accused each other of witchcraft. In America's first witch trial, Hugh was found innocent, while Mary was acquitted of witchcraft, but she was still sentenced to be hanged as punishment for the death of her child. She died in prison. About 80 people throughout England's Massachusetts Bay Colony were accused of practicing witchcraft. 13 women and 2 men were executed in a witch hunt that occurred throughout New England and lasted from 1645 to 1663. The Salem witch trials followed in 1692 to 1693. Current scholarly estimates of the number of people who were executed for witchcraft in the 300 years period vary from about 35,000 to 50,000. The total number of witch trials in Europe which are known to have ended in executions is around 12,000. Prominent contemporaneous critics of witch hunts included John Francesco Ponzinibbio, 1520, Johannes Weir, 1515 to 1588, Reginald Scott, 1538 to 1599, Cornelius Luce, 1546 to 1595, Anton Pretorius, 1560 to 1613. Alonso Salazar y Frias, 1564 to 1636, Friedrich Spee, 1591 to 1635, and Balthasar Becker, 1634 to 1698. Among the largest and most notable of these trials of history were the Trier witch trials, 1581 to 1593, the Fulda witch trials, 1603 to 1606, the Würzburg witch trial, 1626 to 1631, and the Bamberg witch trials, 1626 to 1631. In England and Scotland between 1542 and 1735, a series of witchcraft acts enshrined into law the punishment, often with death, sometimes with incarceration, of individuals practicing or claiming to practice witchcraft and magic. The last executions for witchcraft in England had taken place in 1682, when Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards were executed at Exeter. In 1711, Joseph Addison published an article in the highly respected The Spectator Journal, number 117, criticizing the irrationality and social injustice in treating elderly and feeble women as witches. Jane Wenham was among the last subject of witch hunt trial in England in 1712 but was pardoned after her conviction and set free. Janet Horne was executed for witchcraft in Scotland in 1727. The final act of 1735 led to prosecution for fraud rather than witchcraft, since it was no longer believed that the individuals had actual supernatural powers or traffic with Satan. The 1735 Act continued to be used until the 1940s to prosecute individuals such as spiritualists and gypsies. The act was finally repealed in 1951. The last execution of a witch in the Dutch Republic was probably in 1613. In Denmark, this took place in 1693 with the execution of Anna Pauls, and in Norway the last witch execution was of Johan Nilsdatter in 1695, and in Sweden Anna Eriksdotter in 1704. In other parts of Europe, the practice died down later. In France, the last person to be executed for witchcraft was Louis de Barras in 1745. In Germany, the last death sentence was that of Anna Schwegelin in Kempten in 1775. In Poland, the last official witch trial was the Dorochow witch trial in 1783. In Croatia, the last person found guilty for witchcraft and sentenced to the death penalty was Magda Logomer in 1758. She was acquitted by Maria Theresa in 1758, putting an end to the witch trials in Croatia. In India, the earliest evidence of witch hunt can be found in the Santhal witch trial in 1792. In the Singhbum district of the Chotanagpur division in company-ruled India, not only were those accused of being witches murdered, but also those related to the accused to ensure that they would not avenge the deaths. The Chotanagpur region was majorly populated by an Adivasi population called the Santhals. The existence of witches was a belief central to the Santhals. Witches were feared and were supposed to be engaged in anti-social activities. They were also supposed to have the power to kill people by feeding on their entrails, and causing fevers in cattle among other evils. Therefore, according to the Adivasi population, the cure to their disease and sickness was the elimination of these witches who were seen as the cause. The practice of witch hunt among Santhals was more brutal than that in Europe. Unlike Europe, where witches were strangulated before being burnt, the Santhals forced them to eat human excreta and drink blood before throwing them into the flames. Witch hunts still occur today in societies where belief in magic is prevalent. In most cases, these are instances of lynching and burnings, reported with some regularity from much of sub-Saharan Africa, from Saudi Arabia and from Papua New Guinea. In addition, there are some countries that have legislation against the practice of sorcery. The only country where witchcraft remains legally punishable by death is Saudi Arabia. On the 29th and the 30th of June 2015, militants of the radical Islam terrorist group Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL or ISIS, beheaded two couples on accusations of sorcery and using magic for medicine in Deir-ez-Zor province of the self-proclaimed Islamic State. Earlier on, the ISIL militants beheaded several magicians and street illusionists in Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Witchcraft or sorcery remains a criminal offense in Saudi Arabia, although the precise nature of the crime is undefined. The frequency of prosecutions for this in the country as whole is unknown. However, in November 2009, it was reported that 118 people had been arrested in the province of Makkah that year for practicing magic and using the Book of Allah in a derogatory manner, 74% of them being female. According to Human Rights Watch in 2009, prosecutions for witchcraft and sorcery are proliferating and Saudi courts are sanctioning a literal witch hunt by the religious police. In 2006, an illiterate Saudi woman, Fawza Faleh, was convicted of practicing witchcraft, including casting an impotent spell, and sentenced to death by beheading, after allegedly being beaten and forced to fingerprint a false confession that had not been read to her. After an appeal court had cast doubt on the validity of the death sentence because the confession had been retracted, the lower court reaffirmed the same sentence on a different basis. In 2007, Mustafa Ibrahim, an Egyptian national, was executed, having been convicted of using sorcery in an attempt to separate a married couple, as well as of adultery and of desecrating the Quran. Also in 2007, Abdul Hamid bin Hussein bin Mustafa al-Faqi, a Sudanese national, was sentenced to death after being convicted of producing a spell that would lead to the reconciliation of a divorced couple. In 2009, Ali Sibit, a Lebanese television presenter who had been arrested whilst on a pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, was sentenced to death for witchcraft arising out of his fortune-telling on an Arab satellite channel. His appeal was accepted by one court, but a second in Medina upheld his death sentence again in March 2010, stating that he deserved it as he had publicly practiced sorcery in front of millions of viewers for several years. In November 2010, the Supreme Court refused to ratify the death sentence, stating that there was insufficient evidence that his actions had harmed others. On December 12, 2011, Amina bint Abdulalim Nasser was beheaded in Al-Jawf province after being convicted of practicing witchcraft and sorcery. Another very similar situation occurred to Muray bin Ali bin Isa al-Asiri, and he was beheaded on June 19, 2012 in the Najran province. In Papua New Guinea, though the practice of white magic, such as faith healing, is legal in Papua New Guinea, the 1976 Sorcery Act imposed a penalty of up to 2 years in prison for the practice of black magic, until the act was repealed in 2013. In 2009, the government reports that extrajudicial torture and murder of alleged witches, usually lone women, are spreading from the highland areas to cities as villagers migrate to urban areas. In June 2013, 4 women were accused of witchcraft because the family had a permanent house made of wood, and the family had tertiary educations and high social standing. All of the women were tortured, and Helen Rambali was beheaded. Helen Hakina, chairwoman of the North Bougainville Human Rights Committee, said that the accusation started because of economic jealousy born of a mining boom. Province of Simbu in Papua New Guinea alone, it's estimated about 150 cases of violence and killings are occurring each year. Reports indicate this practice of witch hunting has in some places evolved into something more malignant, sadistic and voyeuristic. One woman who was attacked by young men from a nearby village had her genitals burned and fused beyond functional repair by the repeated intrusions of red-hot irons. Some people in India, mostly in villages, have the belief that witchcraft and black magic are effective. On one hand, people may seek advice from witch doctors for health, financial or marital problems. In the other hand, people, especially women, are accused of witchcraft and attacked, occasionally killed. It has been reported that mostly widows or divorcees are targeted to rob them of their property. In June 2013, National Commission for Women, NCW, reported that according to National Crime Records Bureau statistics, 768 women had been murdered for allegedly practicing witchcraft since 2008 and announced plans for newer laws. Between 2001 and 2006, an estimated 300 people were killed in the state of Assam. Between 2005 and 2010, about 35 witchcraft-related murders reportedly took place in eastern India, Odisha's Sundargarh district. In October 2003, 3 women were branded as witch and humiliated. Afterwards, they all committed suicide in Komalpura village in Muzaffarpur district in Bihar. In August 2013, a couple were hacked to death by a group of people in Kokrajhar district in Assam. In September 2013, in the Jashpur district of Chhattisgarh, a woman was murdered and her daughter was raped on the allegation that they were practicing black magic. A 2010 estimate places the number of women killed as witches in India at between 150 and 200 per year, or a total of 2,500 in the period of 1995 to 2009. In India, labeling a woman as a witch is a common ploy to grab land, settle scores, or even to punish her for turning down sexual advances. In a majority of the cases, it is difficult for the accused woman to reach out for help, and she is forced to either abandon her home and family or driven to commit suicide. Most cases are not documented because it is difficult for poor and illiterate women to travel from isolated regions to file police reports. Less than 2% of those accused of witch hunting are actually convicted, according to a study by the Free Legal Aid Committee, a group that works with victims in the state of Jharkhand. In many societies of sub-Saharan Africa, the fear of witches drives periodic witch hunts during which specialist witch finders identify suspects, with death by lynching often the result. These countries particularly affected by this phenomenon include South Africa, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Zambia. Witch hunts against children were reported by the BBC in 1999 in the Congo. And in Tanzania, where the government responded to attacks on women accused of being witches for having red eyes. A lawsuit was launched in 2001 in Ghana, where witch hunts are also common, by a woman accused of being a witch. Witch hunts in Africa are often led by relatives seeking the property of the accused victim. In Zambia, the Bemba people believed misfortunes such as wartings, hauntings, and famines to be just actions sanctioned by the high god Lisa. The only agency which caused unjust harm was a witch, who had enormous powers and was hard to detect. After white rule of Africa, beliefs in sorcery and witchcraft grew, possibly because of the social strain caused by new ideas, customs, and laws, and also because the courts no longer allowed witches to be tried. Amongst the Bantu tribes of southern Africa, the witch smellers were responsible for detecting witches. In parts of southern Africa, several hundred people have been killed in witch hunts since 1990. In March 2009, Amnesty International reported that up to 1,000 people in the Gambia had been abducted by government-sponsored witch doctors on charges of witchcraft, and taken to detention centers where they were forced to drink poisonous concoctions. On May 21, 2009, the New York Times reported that the alleged witch-hunting campaign had been sparked by the Gambian president, Yahya Jammeh. In other regions, mostly in Asia and Africa, have official legislation against witchcraft is still found in Saudi Arabia and Cameroon today.